The human body is very sensitive to changes in its internal environment. Throughout our lives, the body balances the competing demands that are within it in order to maintain homeostasis. While all of the body systems contribute in some way to this internal balance, we see that homeostasis is really heavily controlled by the autonomic nervous system. So reviewing here the peripheral nervous system, recall that it has two branches. It has the sensory division and the motor division. The function of the sensory division is to relay information from the sensory receptors to the brain and to the spinal cord, that is, in total, to the central nervous system for interpretation and integration. The motor division, on the other hand, of the peripheral nervous system controls muscles and glands. The motor division can be further subdivided into the somatic motor and the autonomic motor divisions. The somatic motor controls the skeletal muscles, while the autonomic motor division controls cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. Further, we see that there are two divisions to the autonomic nervous system. We see that there is the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. The sympathetic division functions as the fight or flight division, which rallies the body for activity or to escape from dangerous situations. The parasympathetic division is called the rest and digest division because it promotes digestion, urination, reproduction, and other body maintenance functions. So let's now look at how the neurons are configured for both the somatic and autonomic divisions. We saw that the somatic nervous system contains somatic motor neurons that have synapses with skeletal muscles. These neurons release the neurotransmitter acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction. These neurons extend from the brain or the spinal cord directly to the effectors, in this case the skeletal muscles, that they control. In contrast to this, the autonomic nervous system uses a two-neuron chain, and the effectors are the involuntary muscles. So as we've discussed, those muscles are cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or they could be glands. The first neuron in this chain is called the preganglionic neuron, and it extends from the brain or the spinal cord to a ganglion, where it synapses with the second neuron, which is called the postganglionic neuron. The postganglionic neuron will then stimulate its effector. The neurotransmitter that is released by all the preganglionic neurons is acetylcholine, while the postganglionic neurons of the sympathetic division release norepinephrine. The postganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic division release acetylcholine at their effectors. Both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system serve the same organs, but they generally produce the opposite effects at those organs. There are also some key anatomical differences between the two. First, the neuron axons of the parasympathetic division, which is shown here on the left side of this diagram. The axons of the parasympathetic division emerge from the brainstem or the sacral region of the spinal nerves. So for this reason, the parasympathetic division is anatomically referred to as the craniosacral division. The sympathetic neuron axons, on the other hand, emerge from the thoracic or lumbar region of the spinal cord. So this division is anatomically referred to as the thoracolumbar division. In the parasympathetic division, the preganglionic axons of the preganglionic neurons tend to be very long and extend to ganglia that are in very close proximity to the effector organ. The axons of the postganglionic neurons that emerge from those parasympathetic ganglia tend to be very short and connect to their target organ or their effector organ. The opposite is true for the sympathetic division. The preganglionic axons of the preganglionic neurons tend to be very short, and the postganglionic axons tend to be quite long. The sympathetic ganglia are arranged in a chain-like configuration along the lateral parts of the vertebral column, which are often referred to as the sympathetic trunk ganglia or the sympathetic chain ganglia. There are two varieties of acetylcholine receptors that exist on target organs. We see the nicotinic variety of acetylcholine receptor and the muscarinic variety of acetylcholine receptor. Nicotinic receptors respond to nicotine in addition to responding to acetylcholine, while the muscarinic acetylcholine receptors respond to a substance called muscarine, in addition to also responding to acetylcholine. Nicotinic acetylcholine receptors are found on all postganglionic neurons, on skeletal muscle cells at the neuromuscular junction, and are also on the cells of the adrenal medulla, which are cells that are located within the adrenal gland. The muscarinic variety of acetylcholine receptors are found on basically all of the parasympathetic target organs. So both receptors, that is the nicotinic and muscarinic variety of receptor, tend to produce excitation or stimulation at the target organs, which is going to activate the parasympathetic response. The one major exception here is cardiac muscle, which tends to be inhibited by acetylcholine instead of excited by it. On the other hand, there are 5 types of norepinephrine receptors on sympathetic target organs. So the main neurotransmitter of the sympathetic branch is going to be norepinephrine, at least the neurotransmitter that's released at the target organs. The norepinephrine receptors are simply called beta 1, beta 2, beta 3, and alpha 1 and alpha 2. Beta 1 are generally located on the heart, the kidneys, and the adipose tissue. In these organs, their activation increases heart rate, increases force of contraction if it's the heart that we're dealing with here. It also stimulates the kidneys to release a substance called renin, which plays a huge role in maintaining high blood pressure during activity or during fight or flight responses. Beta 2 receptors are found in the lungs and the blood vessels that serve the heart, the liver, and the skeletal muscles. Their activation will dilate blood vessels and will also dilate the airways of the lungs, so it allows greater blood flow and greater airflow during activity. It also tends to relax the digestive and urinary system organs, which is going to slow their activity. Beta 3 are primarily found in adipose tissue, which causes the adipose tissue to undergo what's called lipolysis. So this is going to break down its store of lipids and fats in order to make energy, or ATP, from those. The alpha 1 receptors are found on nearly all of the parasympathetic target organs, specifically blood vessels that are serving the skin, the abdominal organs, the kidneys, and the salivary glands. So this activation is going to cause the constriction of the blood vessels that serve these organs, which is going to slow the activity of these particular organs here. And finally, alpha 2 receptors are found on the ends of the axons of neurons that release norepinephrine, or are found on receptors in the pancreas. So the activation of these receptors will tend to inhibit the neurons that release additional norepinephrine, while the activation of the receptors in the pancreas inhibits the secretion of insulin. So what this means is that blood glucose will tend to remain pretty high during activity, which is going to allow the body to make use of that glucose as a fuel. This table here highlights a couple of drug classes that bind to and influence both the acetylcholine receptors and the norepinephrine receptors. Nicotinic agents, for example, nicotine, are able to bind to the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors on those postganglionic neurons, and these drugs are going to typically stimulate sympathetic effects. Other types of chemicals, like acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, tend to interfere with the ability of the enzyme called acetylcholinesterase, which is going to break down ACH, which allows ACH to stay around for a longer period of time, helps to prolong the effect of any released acetylcholine. So one of these chemicals, which is called sarin, is a gas that's used as a chemical warfare agent, and it also tends to prolong muscle stimulation to the point where muscles contract and then never relax, and so it makes people who have been exposed to this gas, it makes it very difficult for them to breathe, because the muscles that control their respiration will contract and not relax, and it makes it very difficult to breathe. And also other types of compounds that make use of acetylcholinesterase inhibitors are things like insecticides. So that's why they kill insects, is because it affects the acetylcholine in the neurons of insects. Others like albuterol and phenylephrine will bind to norepinephrine receptors. Albuterol is a substance that dilates bronchioles and or the small air passageways in the lungs, and it's used to treat asthma. So they're used as rescue inhalers to open up the airways during an asthma attack. And phenylephrine dilates blood vessels in the nostrils and works as a nasal decongestant. There's another family of drugs that's called beta blockers, and they bind to the beta norepinephrine receptors and inhibit the activity of the cells with those beta receptors. Beta blockers are commonly used to treat conditions like hypertension, which is high blood pressure, by causing the smooth muscle in the walls of the blood vessels to relax, and that allows the vessels to dilate and the blood pressure to fall as a result of that, or to drop as a result of that. So let's very quickly summarize some of the major effects of the sympathetic division. The sympathetic division will increase heart rate and force of contraction for the heart, which is going to push greater volumes of blood through the body during activity. It's also going to promote the breakdown of lipids in adipose tissue in order to make ATP energy for the body, so that way we can use that energy during activity. It's going to dilate the airways for better airflow to and from the lungs. And it's also going to slow the function of the digestive system, and as well as the urinary system and reproductive systems. It's also going to inhibit the secretion of insulin by the endocrine system. The parasympathetic division is going to have the opposite effects that we saw from the sympathetic division. It tends to decrease heart rate as well as constrict the airways, because when the body is at rest, the cardiovascular and respiratory demands are much less. In the digestive system, digestive activity as well as the motility of the food and waste moving through the system is increased, so that way we can digest the food, the meal that we've just eaten, and put that fuel and those compounds into the body so that our body can use those to build things and maintain the body. In the urinary system, we see that the parasympathetic division promotes voiding of the urinary bladder in order to remove any stored urine that is accumulated.